A forgotten railroad town kept drowning beneath endless rain, while one woman waited 10 years for a soldier who would never return. Before anyone discovered the truth, an old black horse named Ghost refused to leave an abandoned mail carriage filled with hidden letters and broken promises. The rider soon uncovered a dead man's dream of building a small wooden home for the woman he loved. A broken station master believed lies could protect people from grief, but silence slowly destroyed an entire town instead. While storms flooded the valley, Ghost kept leading everyone toward a lonely hill where a life should have begun years ago. Tonight's story is about love, loss, faith, and how God sometimes works through strangers to finish forgotten miracles. Before we ride into Rainfall Crossing, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Rain had been falling over Rainfall Crossing for so many days that the town no longer smelled like earth. It smelled like wet wood, coal smoke, rusted iron, and old grief that had nowhere left to go. Mud covered the streets so deeply that wagon wheels sank halfway into the ground, and the constant dripping from rooftops sounded almost like quiet ticking clocks counting down forgotten years. The rider arrived shortly before dusk, riding slowly through the rain beside Ghost, the old black American quarter horse moving with the tired patience of an animal that had crossed too many dying towns to fear another one. Ghost was 16 now, tall and muscular beneath the scars that crossed the dark coat, like old memories carved into flesh. A faded white star rested on the horse's forehead, barely visible beneath rainwater running through the tangled mane. The burn scar along the left shoulder from Frost Hollow still had not fully healed, and the slight limp in the rear leg returned whenever the weather turned cold. Yet Ghost's eyes remained alert, intelligent dark brown eyes that always seemed to notice sorrow before humans did. The rider pulled the brim of the worn black hat lower as the train whistle echoed somewhere beyond the fog. The sound rolled through the valley like a wounded animal crying in the distance. Rainfall Crossing appeared slowly through the mist, crooked wooden buildings leaning toward the tracks, rust-stained water towers, dim lanterns flickering weakly behind wet windows. People moved quietly through the mud with shoulders lowered against the rain. Nobody laughed. Nobody hurried. The war had ended years ago, but the town still looked like it had never truly stopped waiting for something to return. Ghost slowed near the station. The rider immediately noticed the horse's ears shift forward, not toward the people, not toward the arriving train, toward the final rail car sitting abandoned near the edge of the yard. The old mail carriage looked half dead. Rainwater dripped through holes in the roof. Moss and rust crawled along the metal sides. One wheel sat crooked in the mud like a broken knee. The faded words, "United States Mail," barely remained visible beneath years of rain and neglect. Ghost stopped completely. The rider exhaled slowly. What is it now? The horse did not move. Ghost stared at the carriage with strange stillness, nostrils flaring softly as rain slid down the scarred black face. The rider had learned years ago not to ignore moments like that. Ghost reacted to fear differently than humans did. Sometimes blood, sometimes death, sometimes something even quieter than both. A station worker passed nearby carrying coal. "Horse been doing that all week?" The man chuckled nervously. "Wouldn't get too close to that old thing. Whole car smells like mildew and ghosts." The rider looked again toward the carriage. Ghost still refused to walk. Then the train whistle sounded again. The horse suddenly turned away from the carriage and began moving toward the platform. That was where the rider first saw Eleanor Grace. She stood alone beneath a black umbrella near the final platform, completely motionless despite the cold rain soaking the edges of her dark wool dress. She looked no older than 34, though sadness had aged her in quieter ways. Her face was pale and delicate, framed by dark brown hair tied loosely into a low bun that rain and wind kept pulling apart. Thin strands stuck against her cheeks, while tired blue eyes searched every passing train window with impossible patience. She was beautiful in the way abandoned places could still become beautiful under certain light, fragile, worn, but stubbornly alive. People around the station barely looked at her anymore. They had grown used to her waiting. A woman selling coffee whispered quietly to the rider as he passed, "Every Thursday for nearly 10 years. "For who?" the rider asked. "Thomas Hale, soldier boy, never came home." The rider glanced back toward Eleanor. She kept watching the train. Every passenger stepped down except the one she wanted. Still, she waited until the final conductor climbed aboard again and the train slowly disappeared into the rain. Only then did disappointment cross her face. Not dramatic, not loud, just the expression of someone watching hope die in tiny pieces, week after week, without ever fully letting it go. Ghost approached her carefully. The old horse lowered the head slightly. Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Well?" A faint smile finally touched her tired face. "You're kinder than most people around here." Ghost stood beside her quietly. Rain dripped from the horse's mane, while Eleanor gently touched the scarred black face. The rider watched the horse carefully. Ghost usually distrusted strangers, especially grieving strangers, but the old horse remained calm beside Eleanor, like the animal recognized something broken inside her. "You waiting for someone?" the rider finally asked. Eleanor looked back toward the empty tracks. "I always am." The rider noticed she carried old letters tied carefully beneath her coat. Not one or two. Dozens. A man's voice interrupted them behind the station office. "Miss Grace." The speaker was an elderly station master, stepping slowly beneath the rain lanterns. Tobias Reed looked as old as the station itself. Thin body, bent shoulders, white beard trimmed unevenly along a narrow, weathered face. His gray eyes carried the permanent exhaustion of someone who had spent too many years delivering bad news. The heavy station coat hung loosely from his frame, and his hands shook slightly whenever he adjusted the lantern. "Storm's getting worse," Tobias said gently. "No point waiting longer tonight." Eleanor nodded politely but did not move immediately. Tobias looked toward the rider and Ghost. "Traveler?" "For now." The old man studied Ghost carefully. "Strange horse," the rider answered quietly. "Sometimes." Tobias glanced toward the abandoned mail carriage at the edge of the yard. His expression darkened for only a second before disappearing again. "You should stable the horse away from there." "Why?" "Because some things rot better left untouched." The rider noticed Ghost staring past Tobias toward the old carriage again. Rain ran harder now, hammering rooftops and tracks. Tobias sighed heavily. Some people survive only because hope lies to them. Eleanor lowered her eyes after hearing that. The rider saw the pain immediately. Whatever existed between Eleanor and the station master carried years of silence beneath it. Later that night, rain battered the stable roof hard enough to shake dust from the beams. The rider slept lightly beneath his coat until a familiar sound woke him. An empty stall. Ghost was gone. The rider stood immediately. Outside, cold rain soaked the town silver beneath lantern light. Mud pulled at his boots as he followed hoofprints through the darkness toward the rail yard, toward the abandoned mail carriage. Ghost stood beside it again. The old horse pawed the ground once, then looked toward the rider with tense alertness. "What did you find?" Wind screamed suddenly through the yard. The carriage door creaked open by itself. Ghost stepped backward uneasily. The rider climbed inside. The smell hit immediately. Wet paper, mold, old leather, and something else beneath it, something painfully human. Scattered mailbags covered the floor beneath years of dust and water stains. Broken shelves leaned sideways against the walls, while rain dripped through the roof into shallow puddles. Then wind rushed through the open door. One envelope slid loose from beneath a collapsed bag. It fluttered slowly across the floor and landed at the rider's boots. He picked it up carefully. The paper was yellow with age. The seal remained unbroken, written across the front in faded ink, Eleanor Grace. The rider stared silently at the letter while rain hammered the carriage roof overhead. Ghost watched from outside the doorway without moving, and for the first time since entering Rainfall Crossing, the rider understood. Someone had stopped these letters from ever reaching her. Rainfall Crossing smelled even colder the next morning. The storm had not weakened during the night. If anything, the rain seemed heavier now, turning the rail yard into a swamp of black mud and standing water. Smoke from coal furnaces drifted low between the buildings and mixed with the fog until the whole town looked drowned beneath gray shadows. The rider stood inside the abandoned mail carriage while rain hammered the rusted roof above him. Water dripped steadily through holes in the ceiling onto piles of rotting mailbags scattered across the floorboards. The old envelope addressed to Eleanor Grace remained in his hand, its paper soft with age, but still unopened. Ghost waited outside the carriage doorway beneath the rain, the old black horse standing perfectly still, except for the slow movement of scarred ribs beneath wet skin. The horse had barely slept. Every few minutes, Ghost lowered the head toward the floorboards of the carriage again, sniffing softly like an animal trying to follow a scent buried beneath years of dust and sorrow. The rider stepped down from the carriage and headed toward the station office just after sunrise. Tobias Reed was already awake inside, sitting alone beside a coal stove that barely gave enough warmth to fight the damp cold crawling through the room. The old station master looked worse in daylight. His thin shoulders curved inward beneath the heavy railway coat, and deep purple shadows rested beneath tired gray eyes that had probably spent decades reading death notices before anyone else did. A chipped coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand from age and exhaustion. Papers covered the desk around him in careful stacks, every document organized with almost obsessive precision, as if keeping the station orderly was the only thing holding the old man together. Tobias looked up slowly when the rider entered. "You found the carriage," he said quietly. The rider placed Eleanor's unopened letter on the desk without speaking. The old man stared at it for several seconds. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He did not look surprised. "I wondered how long before that horse led somebody there," Tobias finally murmured. "You knew?" "Yes." "Why?" Tobias leaned back slowly in the wooden chair, eyes fixed on the rain-covered station windows. Outside, another freight train groaned somewhere in the distance. "Because grief kills people," he answered softly, "sometimes slower than bullets, sometimes worse." The rider remained silent. The old man's voice became rougher. "After the war, every train that came through this town carried death in paper form, hundreds of letters, mothers losing sons, wives losing husbands, little boys finding out their fathers weren't coming home." He rubbed one trembling hand over his tired face. "You know what happens after enough years of that?" The rider said nothing. "I started remembering faces before names," Tobias continued. "I knew which houses would go dark after I knocked on the door." For the first time since meeting him, the station master's calm expression cracked slightly. "There was a woman named Clara Bennett," Tobias said. "Red hair, tiny thing. Her boy died at Franklin Ridge. I handed her the telegram myself." His eyes drifted downward. 3 days later, they found her hanging inside her barn. The room fell silent except for rain striking the roof. Tobias swallowed hard. A man named Henry Walsh drank himself to death beside the tracks after his wife and daughters died in a fever camp during the war. Another woman lost both sons the same winter and started talking to empty chairs like they were still sitting there. He stared toward the stove fire with hollow eyes. People think war ends when the shooting stops. It doesn't. It just changes shape. The rider finally spoke. So you decided truth was too dangerous. Tobias closed his eyes briefly. I decided some people only survive because hope lies to them. Outside, Ghost suddenly shifted. The horse lifted the head sharply toward the station window. The rider noticed immediately. Ghost never reacted without reason. Then came the sound of footsteps through mud outside the office. Eleanor Grace appeared moments later beneath the rain, carrying the same black umbrella from the station platform. Her dark wool dress clung slightly from moisture, and exhaustion rested heavily beneath her pale blue eyes, though she still carried herself with quiet dignity. She looked fragile at first glance, but there was stubborn endurance beneath her calm expression, the kind built from surviving disappointment for too many years without collapsing entirely. I saw your horse near the old carriage again, she said softly to the rider. Most animals avoid that place. Ghost stepped closer to her immediately. The horse lowered the scarred black head until Eleanor's hand rested gently against the faded white star on the forehead. Rain slid down both of them while Ghost stood unusually calm. Tobias watched silently from inside the doorway. Something painful moved across the old man's face. Eleanor noticed the letter on the desk. Her expression changed instantly. What is that? Nobody answered. The silence itself frightened her more than words. The rider saw the color drain from her face. Tobias, she whispered. The old station master looked suddenly older than before. Eleanor, you told me the lines south were destroyed during the war. They were. You told me letters were getting lost. They were. You told me Thomas might still be alive. Tobias lowered his eyes. That was answer enough. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the umbrella handle so hard her knuckles turned white. She did not scream, did not cry. The hurt was too old and too deep for that kind of reaction. Instead, she looked at Tobias like someone slowly realizing an entire decade of life had been built on borrowed illusions. Ghost moved closer beside her. The old horse gently nudged Eleanor's shoulder once, a small gesture, but it kept her standing. Tobias finally spoke again, voice breaking slightly. The last letter from Thomas came 8 years ago. Military hospital west of Lexington, pneumonia after the winter retreat. He swallowed hard. He knew he wasn't coming home. Eleanor stared at him without blinking. And you hid it? I thought... Tobias stopped. I thought if you kept waiting, maybe it would hurt less. Eleanor laughed once, a terrible sound. Not anger, not bitterness, just disbelief. You let me wait for 10 years. The station master's eyes filled with shame. I couldn't watch another person die from grief. Before Eleanor could answer, Ghost suddenly jerked away from her and walked back towards the abandoned mail carriage again. Fast this time, urgent. The rider followed immediately. Rain soaked through his coat as Ghost climbed into the carriage and began pawing aggressively at the floorboards near the rear wall. Wood cracked beneath the horse's hoof. The rider knelt beside the damaged boards. Something hollow echoed underneath. Tobias froze when he saw where Ghost was digging. No! The rider tore away the weakened planks. Beneath them sat a hidden compartment lined with old canvas mail sacks. Dozens, maybe more. Letters, bundles tied with faded ribbon, military telegrams, unopened envelopes, names written across yellowed paper in shaky handwriting. The smell rising from the compartment felt almost suffocating. Wet paper, dust, old ink, and years of trapped sorrow sealed beneath rotting wood. Eleanor stared silently. Tobias sat down heavily against the carriage wall. like his legs had finally given out beneath the weight of everything he had hidden. "I only kept Thomas's letter at first," he whispered. "Then others came. More death notices. More grief." His voice trembled harder now. "I told myself I was helping people survive. I kept thinking maybe tomorrow would be kinder if they didn't know today." Ghost stopped pawing. The horse simply stood beside the hidden letters with quiet stillness. Not angry, not afraid, just watching Tobias like an old creature looking at a man who had locked himself inside guilt for too many years to remember how to leave. The rider looked across the forgotten compartment full of undelivered lives, and finally understood. Tobias Reed had never hidden the letters because he was cruel. He had hidden them because he could no longer bear watching people break apart. Rainfall Crossing no longer felt like a town after the discovery beneath the mail carriage floorboards. It felt like a graveyard where the dead had kept speaking for years without anyone hearing them. Rain continued pouring over the valley without rest, washing mud through the rail yard and turning the train tracks into long black rivers disappearing into fog. Every sound carried differently now. The station bells sounded lonelier. The train whistles sounded almost mournful. Even the people walking through town seemed quieter after whispers began spreading about the hidden letters beneath the abandoned carriage. The rider returned to the rail yard before sunrise. Ghost stood beside the old mail car, exactly where he had remained most of the night. Rainwater darkened the horse's scarred black coat until Ghost almost blended into the storm itself. The old horse looked exhausted. The burned scar along the left shoulder twitched occasionally beneath the cold rain, and the slight rear leg limp had grown more visible from standing too long in the mud. Yet Ghost still refused to leave the carriage. The rider rested one hand against the horse's neck. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Ghost lowered the head toward the rotten floorboards again. The rider understood. Whatever remained hidden inside the carriage was not finished with them yet. By morning, Eleanor Grace arrived, carrying an old lantern beneath her rain cloak. She looked different now. The softness in her face remained, but the fragile hope she had carried for years had begun cracking into something heavier and far more dangerous. Truth. Her pale skin looked almost colorless beneath the gray sky, and dark circles rested beneath tired blue eyes that had barely slept. Wet strands of dark brown hair clung to her cheeks as she stepped carefully through the mud toward the carriage. Behind her came Samuel Pike. The former mail carrier walked with a noticeable limp through the flooded rail yard, dragging his right leg slightly behind him. Samuel looked about 58, though hardship had aged him beyond that. His body was thin and weathered from years riding rough postal routes through storms and mountain passes. A rough gray stubble covered his narrow jaw, and deep lines cut across his face, from decades spent outdoors beneath wind and sun. His old mail coat hung crooked across one shoulder, patched repeatedly over the years. One eye narrowed slightly more than the other from an old injury near Franklin Ridge during the war. Samuel carried himself like a man who had learned survival by lowering his head and continuing forward, no matter what guilt followed behind him. He avoided Eleanor's eyes when he arrived. "That whole car's falling apart," Samuel muttered quietly. "Storm keeps up another week and the roof'll collapse." The rider climbed into the carriage first. Rotting wood groaned beneath his boots. Rainwater dripped steadily through broken roof panels into puddles covering the floor. The hidden compartment remained open, exposing stacks of letters tied together with faded ribbon and military twine. Some envelopes had already swollen from moisture, their ink beginning to blur after years trapped inside darkness. Eleanor stepped inside slowly behind him. For several seconds, she simply stared. Hundreds of letters, entire lives folded into paper. Ghost remained outside the carriage doorway, watching silently through the rain. Samuel removed his hat uneasily. Most of those came during the last winter of the war, he admitted. Tobias started keeping them after Thomas's letter. Eleanor finally looked at him, and you knew. Samuel swallowed hard. Not at first, but eventually you did. Yes. Why didn't you stop him? The old mail carrier rubbed one trembling hand across his beard. Because hope keeps people alive longer than truth sometimes. His voice cracked slightly. I saw too many families die after the war ended. People think bullets kill men. Sometimes letters do too. Eleanor turned away without answering. She began kneeling beside the piles of letters instead, carefully touching envelopes one at a time. Then she froze. The writer watched her fingers tremble. She recognized the handwriting. Her own. Dozens of envelopes. Every letter she had written to Thomas over the years sat untouched beneath layers of dust and mildew. Letters filled with promises, memories, small details of ordinary life and endless waiting. None had ever left Rainfall Crossing. Eleanor slowly opened one. The paper inside remained surprisingly intact. Thomas, the rain finally stopped today. I planted flowers beside your mother's grave because you always said she hated empty ground. Her voice faded. The writer looked away, quietly. Some grief should not be watched directly. Outside, wind howled through the rail yard, hard enough to shake the entire carriage. Ghost suddenly lifted the head sharply. The horse's ears turned toward the far corner, beneath one of the broken benches. Then Ghost stepped into the carriage. Samuel stiffened nervously as the large black horse moved through the narrow interior. But Ghost ignored everyone completely. Water dripped from the horse's mane onto the rotting floorboards, while the animal sniffed aggressively beneath the rear bench. The rider noticed Ghost becoming restless again, not frightened, focused. The horse pawed once against the wood, then again, harder. The old bench shifted slightly. Ghost suddenly jerked backward and pulled something loose from beneath the collapsed seat. A military canvas satchel slid across the wet floorboards, old, mud-stained, half-rotted with age, but carefully tied shut. Eleanor stared at it without breathing. The rider knelt slowly beside the bag and untied the leather straps. Inside rested a weathered notebook, a bundle of rusted carpenter nails wrapped in cloth, an old brass key, and several folded pages covered in neat pencil sketches. The sketches showed a small wooden house, simple, but detailed with impossible care. A front porch, a stone chimney, 2 rocking chairs beneath a rain awning, apple trees behind the house. Samuel whispered quietly, "Thomas drew that before he enlisted." The rider opened the notebook carefully. Most pages contained measurements, supply lists, and rough calculations written in dark pencil. Thomas Hale had not filled the journal with dreams of war or glory. He had filled it with plans for a home. Eleanor sat down slowly against the carriage wall as the rider continued reading. Page after page described ordinary hopes, building kitchen shelves, fixing roof leaks before winter, hearing rain on the porch roof, watching Eleanor read beside the fireplace. Not once did Thomas describe becoming a hero. Not once did he mention medals, only returning home. The rider finally found a loose note folded between the pages. "If the war ends before spring, I think I can finish the foundation before the heavy rains come. Eleanor wants windows facing the tracks. She says she wants to hear trains at night without feeling lonely anymore." The carriage fell silent except for rain. Eleanor still had not cried. That frightened the rider more than tears would have. She looked at the drawings the way people look at graves, not because something had died recently, because they suddenly realized how long it had already been gone. Samuel sat heavily near the doorway, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Thomas talked about that house every damn week before he shipped out," he muttered. "Kid carried those drawings everywhere." The rider studied the sketches again. The lines were careful, patient, precise. A carpenter's hands had drawn them, not a soldier's. Ghost lowered the scarred black head beside Eleanor quietly. The horse touched the canvas satchel gently with the nose, almost protectively. And in that moment, the rider finally understood something deeper than the hidden letters themselves. Thomas Hale had never dreamed about becoming part of the war. He had only dreamed about surviving it long enough to come home and build a life with the woman he loved. The rain over Rainfall Crossing changed by the fourth day. It no longer sounded violent. It sounded tired. Water dripped slowly from rooftops, railroad signs, and broken fences like the entire town had grown exhausted from carrying sorrow too long. Thick fog rolled through the valley every morning now, swallowing the train tracks until the rails looked like black scars disappearing into nowhere. The abandoned mail carriage still stood near the edge of the yard, but people had stopped walking close to it after rumors spread about the hidden letters inside. Some called the carriage cursed. Others called it holy. Most simply lowered their eyes when they passed it. The rider spent most of that morning inside the stable beside Ghost. The old black horse rested quietly beneath the leaking wooden roof, while rainwater tapped against the beams overhead. Ghost looked older than usual in the gray light. The burn scar along the left shoulder remained stiff from cold weather, and the slight limp in the rear leg had worsened after days standing in mud and rain. Yet the horse's eyes remained alert, constantly watching the doorway like the animal already knew where the day would lead. The rider sat on an overturned bucket reading Thomas Hale's notebook again. The pages smelled faintly of damp leather, sawdust, and old smoke. Thomas's handwriting was careful and clean, written by someone who measured wood for a living and believed small details mattered. There were no grand speeches inside the notebook, no dreams of glory, only ordinary things written with heartbreaking sincerity. Front porch wide enough for 2 chairs, rain roof angled west so storms sound softer at night. Apple tree behind kitchen window because Eleanor likes blossoms in spring. Chair beside fireplace for Eleanor to read during rainstorms. The rider stopped reading for a moment. Outside, another train whistle echoed through the fog. Ghost lifted the head immediately. Then the horse stood, slowly, deliberately. The rider sighed quietly. "You found something else?" Ghost walked toward the stable door before the rider even finished speaking. By midday, Eleanor arrived carrying Thomas's notebook wrapped carefully beneath her dark rain cloak. She looked thinner now, as if truth itself had begun draining weight from her body. Her pale face carried a quiet numbness that frightened the rider more than anger would have. Grief had finally entered her life fully, but it had arrived too late and all at once. Wet strands of dark brown hair rested against her cheeks, while tired blue eyes avoided the train tracks for the first time since the rider had met her. Ghost walked directly toward her. The old horse gently pressed the scarred black face against her shoulder. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly against the horse's mane. "I dreamed about him last night," she whispered softly. The rider said nothing. He wasn't wearing the army coat anymore. Her voice trembled faintly beneath the rain. He was building something. Ghost pulled away suddenly, then began walking toward the hills outside town, not toward the station, not toward the tracks. West. The rider exchanged a glance with Eleanor before both followed. The climb outside Rainfall Crossing became steeper as mud sucked at their boots beneath constant rain. Dead grass bent beneath cold wind sweeping through the hills. The valley below disappeared behind curtains of fog and coal smoke until only distant train whistles reminded them the town still existed. Ghost kept moving forward without hesitation. The horse seemed to know exactly where to go. After nearly half an hour, Ghost stopped near the crest of a small hill, overlooking the tracks below. The rider immediately noticed the wooden stakes. 3 old foundation markers still protruded from the wet earth, nearly buried beneath weeds and moss. Time and rain had rotted them gray, but someone had once measured this ground carefully. Eleanor froze beside him. "Oh, God!" Ghost stepped quietly between the markers. The old horse stood perfectly still in the rain, not grazing, not moving, only watching the empty land. And suddenly the hill no longer looked empty. The rider could almost see it. The porch, the chimney, the warm light behind windows during storms. A life that had nearly existed. Eleanor knelt beside one of the stakes with trembling hands. Mud stained her dress immediately, but she did not seem to notice. Her fingers traced the rough wood carefully, like touching the remains of something sacred. "He brought me here once before the war," she whispered. "Thomas said this hill could hear the trains without being too close to the noise." A faint, broken smile crossed her face. He kept talking about rain on the roof like it was some grand luxury. The rider looked across the hill silently. For Thomas Hale, maybe it had been. Footsteps approached slowly behind them. Tobias Reed climbed the hill, carrying his old station coat tightly against the wind. The elderly station master looked exhausted beyond words. Rain dripped from the brim of his cap, while his thin body shook slightly climbing the muddy slope. When he reached Eleanor, he stopped several feet away. For a long moment he could not speak. Then finally, "I thought I was protecting your heart," Tobias said quietly. Eleanor stared at the old man without answering. Rain tapped softly against the hill around them. Tobias lowered his eyes. "But I only trapped it in time." The words seemed to age him even further after speaking them aloud. Eleanor looked toward the empty foundation again instead of responding, because some apologies arrived too late to change anything. Ghost suddenly shifted. The horse lowered the head sharply near one of the rotting foundation stakes and began pawing at the mud. Once, twice, harder. The rider moved immediately beside the horse. "What is it?" Ghost continued digging. Wet soil scattered beneath the horse's hooves until something metallic struck against stone with a dull sound. The rider knelt into the mud and uncovered a small, rusted tin box buried beneath the foundation marker. Eleanor's breath caught instantly. The box had been wrapped carefully in oilcloth long ago to protect it from rain. The rider opened it slowly. Inside rested a simple copper wedding ring handmade with imperfect edges, several dried apple seeds wrapped in cloth, and a folded piece of paper yellowed by time. The note contained only 3 words: "For our home." Eleanor covered her mouth immediately. For the first time since learning the truth about Thomas, her composure finally cracked. Not violently, not loudly, just quiet tears falling into rainwater while she held the small copper ring against her trembling hands. Ghost lowered the head beside her again. The old horse stood so close his mane brushed against Eleanor's shoulder in the wind. Almost like the animal understood, this hill had once carried somebody's entire future. The rider picked up the dried apple seeds carefully. Thomas had planned everything, not a fantasy, not a dream, a real home, a real life, even the apple trees. Tobias sat heavily against one of the old stakes, staring at the ring with hollow guilt in his eyes. "He used to talk about this place every morning waiting for trains," the old man admitted softly. "Said someday Eleanor would complain about rain leaking through the roof and he'd spend the rest of his life fixing it." Eleanor laughed weakly through tears, a painful sound, but alive. The rider looked again across the empty hill. No walls, no chimney, no porch. Yet somehow the place felt fuller now than any building in Rainfall Crossing, because love had already existed here long before the house ever could. Ghost remained standing between the foundation markers while rain moved through the horse's dark mane. Watching, waiting, like an old guardian refusing to leave behind a life that should have happened. And at last Eleanor understood something grief had hidden from her for years. Thomas Hale had loved her with every ordinary piece of his life, not through grand promises, not through heroic sacrifice, but through the simple dream of coming home and building a place where she would never feel lonely again. The storm arrived before dawn, like the sky itself had finally broken apart above Rainfall Crossing. Rain crashed against rooftops hard enough to shake windows, and thunder rolled continuously through the valley until the mountains sounded hollow inside. The railroad yard had become a lake of black water and floating debris. Mudslides from the surrounding hills buried parts of the lower tracks, and every few hours another freight train whistle echoed somewhere far beyond the storm before vanishing into the rain like a dying animal, lost in fog. The rider woke to the sound of Ghost kicking violently inside the stable. Not panic, warning. The old black horse stood trembling beneath the leaking roof, ears pinned back while rainwater streamed through the tangled mane and across the faded white star on the forehead. The burned scar along the left shoulder looked raw again from cold weather, and the old limp in the rear leg had worsened after climbing the hills the day before. But Ghost's eyes were fixed toward the rail yard with intense urgency. The rider was already pulling on the coat before the horse kicked again. Outside, the storm nearly blinded him. Water rushed through the streets of Rainfall Crossing in dirty rivers carrying broken crates, coal ash, and pieces of wood torn from fences. People shouted through the storm while trying to pull wagons uphill away from the flooding lower district. Then the rider saw it. The abandoned mail carriage had shifted partially off the tracks. One wheel hung crooked above collapsing mud while water surged beneath the rail bed. Another hour, and the entire carriage would slide into the flooded ravine below. Ghost pushed forward immediately through the rain. "No," the rider muttered under his breath. "Not yet." By the time they reached the rail yard, Samuel Pike and Tobias Reed were already there, struggling against the storm. Samuel's damaged leg dragged badly through the mud, but the old mail carrier still fought to secure ropes around the carriage wheels. Tobias looked barely able to stand. Rain poured from the brim of the old stationmaster's cap, while his thin hands shook violently against the freezing wind. Eleanor arrived moments later carrying lanterns wrapped beneath oilcloth. For the first time since learning the truth about Thomas, she looked fully awake instead of numb, not healed, not even close, but alive in a painful way grief sometimes forces people to become after illusions finally die. "The whole embankment's collapsing," Samuel shouted through the storm. "If the carriage goes over, all the letters go with it." The rider looked toward Ghost. The horse was already moving. Ghost stepped through the floodwater toward the carriage without hesitation, muscles straining beneath the soaked black coat. The old horse pressed the shoulder against the warped wooden frame, as if trying to physically hold the carriage in place. The rider grabbed the nearest rope. "Help me secure it." Together they tied thick lines around the rail car and nearby support posts, while rain hammered against them hard enough to sting exposed skin. Mud sucked at boots. Water rushed around their knees. The abandoned carriage groaned loudly each time the weakened earth shifted beneath it. Inside, hundreds of forgotten letters slid across the floor in shallow water. Ghost suddenly jerked the head upward and let out a sharp, low sound deep in the throat. The rider recognized it instantly. The horse had found something. He climbed inside the unstable carriage while rain exploded through holes in the roof overhead. Water dripped through the rotting ceiling onto floating envelopes and collapsed shelves. The whole rail car leaned dangerously now, wood cracking beneath pressure from the collapsing embankment. Ghost pushed the nose beneath one overturned mail crate near the rear wall. The rider shoved it aside. Beneath it rested one final military satchel tied shut with faded leather straps, older than the others, protected carefully beneath layers of cloth. The rider carried it outside beneath the storm while Ghost remained beside him, breathing heavily. Eleanor stared at the bag like she already knew. The rider untied the straps slowly. Inside rested one sealed envelope wrapped carefully in oilcloth, bearing Thomas Hale's handwriting. Eleanor's knees nearly gave out. The storm seemed to disappear around them for several seconds. Only the letter existed. The rider handed it to her, carefully. Her fingers trembled so hard she struggled to open the seal. Rain soaked the paper almost immediately. Thomas's handwriting filled the page in fading black ink. Eleanor, if this reaches you, then I was luckier than most men here. But if it doesn't, maybe someone else will someday understand what I wanted most. It was never the war, never medals, never glory. I only wanted to come home. Eleanor covered her mouth with one shaking hand while continuing to read. I still remember the hill above Rainfall Crossing after the rain. I remember where the porch should face. I remember how you said trains sounded lonely at night. I wanted to build something that would make you feel safe whenever storms came. The rider looked toward Ghost. The old horse stood perfectly still beneath the storm, watching Eleanor, waiting. Then Eleanor reached the final lines. If I never return, please let this house still exist somewhere in the world, because loving you was the only home I ever truly had. Eleanor finally broke, not quietly this time. Years of waiting, denial, grief, and stolen time collapsed all at once beneath the storm. She cried with both hands clutching the soaked letter against her chest, while rain and tears mixed together across her face. Tobias lowered his head completely. Samuel turned away toward the tracks. Even the storm itself seemed quieter afterward. Ghost slowly stepped closer beside Eleanor. The old horse gently rested the scarred face against her shoulder again, not to comfort her completely, only to remind her she was no longer grieving alone. Then the carriage shifted violently. Wood cracked somewhere beneath the tracks. "The embankment's giving out," Samuel shouted. The rider moved immediately. "Get the letters out." For the next hour they carried mailbags through floodwater, while Ghost hauled ropes tied to the carriage frame, helping keep the rail car from sliding into the ravine. The old horse struggled badly now. Mud reached halfway up the legs and pain trembled visibly through the burned shoulder every time Ghost pulled against the ropes. But the horse never stopped, not until the final letters were safe. By dawn, the storm had weakened slightly. Fog drifted across the hills surrounding Rainfall Crossing, while pale gray light spread through the valley. Ghost walked away from the rail yard before anyone else moved, straight toward the hill where Thomas once planned to build the house. The rider followed silently. The horse climbed the muddy slope slowly, exhausted from the night's work, then stopped beside the old foundation stakes and refused to move again. The rider looked around the hill. The empty ground no longer felt empty. Not after the letter, not after the plans, not after learning how deeply Thomas had loved this place before ever building anything upon it. Then the rider finally understood what Ghost had been trying to say since arriving in Rainfall Crossing. The horse had never been leading them toward death. Ghost had been leading them toward an unfinished home. The next morning, before the fog fully lifted from the valley, the rider returned carrying lumber salvaged from the damaged rail yard. Without speaking, he began placing the first foundation beams into the wet earth. Samuel arrived an hour later with tools. Tobias brought nails and old carpentry supplies from storage. Ghost dragged the first heavy timber up the muddy hill through cold rain despite the limp and the pain burning through the scarred shoulder. Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the hill watching them. The rider finally looked toward her. "We're finishing it," he said quietly. "For him." Eleanor covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes again. Not from grief this time, from seeing impossible love continue even after death. By sunset, the outline of the small wooden house finally existed against the rain-covered hill. Only the foundation, only rough beams and mud. But it was real, and for the first time in many years, Eleanor Grace cried not because she had lost Thomas Hale, but because part of him had finally begun coming home. The rain over Rainfall Crossing finally began to weaken after nearly 2 weeks of storms. The clouds still covered the valley every morning, but the endless violence inside the sky had softened into steady mist and drifting fog. Water continued dripping from rooftops and train rails, yet for the first time since the rider arrived, sunlight occasionally broke through the gray for a few brief minutes before disappearing again. The town itself felt quieter now, not because the grief was gone, because people had finally stopped hiding from it. The house on the hill slowly rose from the mud, one beam at a time. Not large, not beautiful in the way wealthy homes were beautiful, but honest. Every board carried fingerprints, rain stains, hammer marks, and exhaustion from the people building it. Samuel Pike spent entire days shaping crooked pieces of salvaged lumber despite the pain in his damaged leg. Tobias Reed worked silently beside him, his old hands trembling while driving nails into wood that should have existed years ago. The elderly station master rarely spoke anymore. Guilt had aged him beyond sleep. Yet every morning he climbed the hill before sunrise, carrying another box of tools, another sack of supplies, another burden he could not undo but still tried to carry. The rider built most of the structure himself. His scarred hands moved through the work with the calm precision of someone who had spent years repairing broken things because nobody else would. He rarely gave instructions. People simply followed him naturally. Even the townsfolk who once avoided the hill began helping quietly after finishing work near the rail yard. An older widow named Martha Vale brought blankets and hot coffee each afternoon. Martha was nearly 60, heavy-set with silver hair braided tightly behind her head and weathered brown skin hardened by years of railroad winters. Her husband had died laying tracks before the war, and since then she had become the kind of woman who showed care through actions instead of words. She rarely smiled, but she stayed long after sunset, helping sew curtains for the small house windows. A young boy named Caleb Mercer carried water buckets uphill every morning before school. Caleb could not have been older than 12, all elbows and oversized boots, with freckles scattered across a narrow face that still looked half-starved from difficult winters. His father had died during the war, and his mother worked cleaning rail offices overnight. Caleb never spoke much, but every time Ghost appeared near the construction site, the boy's face lit up with quiet admiration. Ghost remained beside the house constantly. The old black horse watched over the hill like a living shadow. Even injured and exhausted, Ghost helped drag lumber through mud from the lower rail yard almost every day. The burned scar along the shoulder had reopened from strain, and the rear leg limp worsened badly during cold mornings, but the horse never resisted the harness once. The rider pointed toward the hill. Sometimes Ghost simply stood near the unfinished porch for hours, staring toward the distant train tracks below, like the horse still expected someone to arrive. Eleanor visited less often at first, not because she did not care, because seeing the house become real hurt too much. Every nail driven into the walls reminded her of years Thomas Hale should have lived but never received. Some mornings she climbed halfway up the hill before turning back toward town, unable to continue. Other days she stood hidden beneath trees, watching silently while rain drifted through the valley around the unfinished structure. The rider never pressured her. Grief moved at its own pace. One evening, as fog rolled low across the tracks beneath sunset light, the rider sat alone on the unfinished porch, reading Thomas's notebook again. Ghost rested nearby beneath the half-built awning, breathing slowly through exhaustion while rainwater dripped from the edge of the roof beams. The notebook opened naturally to one page, worn softer than the others. Kitchen window facing east. Eleanor likes morning light while reading. Build porch wide enough to hear rain without getting wet. The writer stared at the handwriting for a long moment. Then Ghost suddenly lifted the head sharply toward the hill path. Eleanor stood there. She wore the same dark rain cloak, but something inside her expression had changed. The endless waiting was gone now. The sorrow remained, deep as ever but no longer frozen. Her tired blue eyes moved slowly across the nearly completed home while wind pushed loose strands of dark brown hair across her pale face. "It looks exactly like his drawings," she whispered. The writer nodded once. Eleanor stepped carefully onto the porch. Her fingers touched the wooden railing softly as if afraid the house might disappear beneath her hands. "I kept trying to imagine this place for years," she admitted quietly, "but after a while, I stopped believing it was ever real." Ghost rose slowly beside her. The old horse lowered the scarred black head until Eleanor rested one trembling hand against the warm, wet mane. Then something unexpected happened. Ghost walked past her into the unfinished house, straight toward the fireplace, and stopped. The rider followed the horse inside. Near the stone foundation beneath the fireplace, Ghost began nudging at loose floorboards stacked nearby. One board shifted aside, revealing a small space beneath the unfinished floor. Inside rested Thomas's carpenter hammer, old, rust-stained, initials carved into the wooden handle. T.H. Eleanor stared at it in shock. "I thought he lost this before leaving for war," she whispered. The rider picked it up carefully. The hammer felt worn smooth from years inside Thomas's hands. Ghost stood beside it quietly, breathing slow and steady while fog drifted through the unfinished doorway behind them. And suddenly the house no longer felt like strangers, rebuilding a dead man's dream. It felt like Thomas had been waiting there all along. Construction finished 3 days later beneath soft morning rain. The completed house stood small against the hill, overlooking Rainfall Crossing. A narrow front porch, 2 wooden chairs, stone chimney, simple kitchen, small reading chair beside the fireplace, and a young apple tree planted behind the house, where rainwater collected gently downhill. Nothing extravagant, only peace. The rider placed Thomas's final letter carefully upon the wooden table near the front window before stepping outside. Eleanor arrived shortly afterward, alone. Nobody followed her inside. Not Samuel, not Tobias, not even the rider. This moment belonged only to her. Rain tapped softly against the roof while Eleanor entered the house for the first time. The rider watched quietly from the porch. She touched every wall slowly, every chair, every window, and when she finally reached the fireplace, she saw Thomas's old hammer resting beside the letter. Eleanor picked up the letter again with trembling hands. Tears finally filled her eyes completely, not the sharp grief from discovering his death. Something gentler, something sadder, the grief of finally reaching the life they should have shared. She stepped outside moments later. The rider stood waiting beside Ghost, beneath the rain. Eleanor looked toward the house behind her. "Why would you build a home for a dead man?" The rider rested one hand against Ghost's neck before answering. "Because some people deserve to come home." His eyes moved briefly toward the glowing windows behind her. "Even if only through the people who loved them." Eleanor cried quietly after hearing that. Not from heartbreak, from relief. In the weeks afterward, Rainfall Crossing slowly changed. Tobias Reed publicly released every remaining hidden letter inside the station hall. Families gathered silently, reading words they should have received years earlier. Some wept, some forgave, some never would. Eleanor turned the small house into a reading home for railroad widows, war orphans, and elderly workers who never learned to read properly. Every Thursday evening she sat beside the fireplace, reading old letters aloud while rain drifted softly across the hill outside, and somehow the house stopped feeling haunted. It began feeling alive. On the morning the rider prepared to leave, thick fog covered the valley again. Eleanor met him beside Ghost near the railroad. She held something small in her hand, the brass key Thomas once carried for the house he never lived to enter. "You should keep it," she said softly. The rider hesitated. Eleanor smiled faintly through tired eyes. "You brought him home more than I ever could." The rider finally accepted the key. He tied it carefully beside Ghost's saddle alongside. The burned bridle ribbon, the iron rail token, the dented tin cup, the wooden doll, the cracked horseshoe, and Thomas's old love letter. As Ghost began walking forward, the brass key and folded letter swayed gently beneath the saddle in the cold morning mist. Rainfall Crossing disappeared slowly behind them. Far above the valley on the hill, smoke finally rose from the chimney of the small wooden house. Ghost stopped walking. The old horse looked back for a very long time. The rider adjusted the worn leather gloves quietly. Then together, both of them continued riding into the fog. Sometimes God does not perform miracles by changing the past. Sometimes the miracle is giving broken people the strength to finish what love could not. Thomas never returned home. The years stolen from Eleanor could never truly be restored. And yet, through rain, grief, and strangers who chose kindness over silence, a forgotten promise finally found its way back into the world. Maybe that is how God still works quietly among us, not always through thunder or impossible signs, but through ordinary people who decide to carry each other's pain instead of walking away from it. In everyday life, many people carry hidden grief like unopened letters inside their hearts. Some are waiting for forgiveness. Some are waiting for someone who never came back. And some are still hoping God has not forgotten them. But maybe love is never truly lost when someone is willing to keep building hope for another person. If this story touched your heart, share where you are watching from and tell us in the comments, what is one memory or promise you will never let disappear? Please like, subscribe, and continue riding with the rider and Ghost for more stories about faith, loss, mercy, and the quiet miracles that still exist in this world. May God bless you, protect your family, heal your hidden wounds, and guide you safely through every storm waiting ahead.